access controls, not as the owner of a folder. So I've got a pinned folder here. This is DDM. I'm hoping everybody's familiar with DDM. And I've got a pinned folder that I've created here. It doesn't matter what type of folder we're looking at, because the access controls can apply to all of them. So the folder that I've just created here, in my case, is a web folder. And I only call it web folder because I allow remote team members to connect from the outside. Now, Susie's sending messages. Right. So what I've done is I've set up a list of tasks, which are the topics that I would like to cover, which is a security setting to prevent editing of group-owned folders. We're then going to look at the group-owned folder permissions, then the group-owned permissions, individually owned permissions, then the not as owner permissions, including add, modify and remove child items, folders and dividers, the ability to modify attributes, delete the folder, and change status to and from. So these middle section are the actual access controls, and there's a comment here that these non-as-owner access controls do not include the ability to transition through a workflow. Okay, so the folder that we're starting with here, this web folder, I've obviously called it Web Shop Focus Not As Owner, is currently owned by a department called the management team as a member of the management team. So in this instance, the folder is owned by the group, not by an individual. Okay, now as a member of the group, I have the ability to edit the content of this particular folder. So I'm demonstrating that by clicking on the description of this item that is work in progress, and we can see that it is locked in this folder. I've included this attribute. Normally the padlock on its own should signify that this part at a status of work in progress is reserved into this folder, and therefore it is reserved by whoever is the owner of the folder. Now, this lock ref column, by the way, is just one that I've switched on here. So we can see that the item's locked in, so we can remove that now. Now, I can edit this because I am a member of the group that owns the folder. Now, the risk with this is if you allow the editing of group-owned folders, you could have two people editing the same information or overwriting each other's files. Okay, so we have an admin option inside here under System, Security. There is an option, if I just close these up here, there is an option in here to prevent users modifying items locked in group-owned folders. So this is a hard setting for everybody. If you do not allow group members to edit items in a folder, then to modify the folder, you need to reserve it out to a separate folder or an action that you are the owner of. Okay, so if I turn this option on and I go back to my folder and I try to modify this item within the folder, it's no longer letting me. If I demonstrate that by opening the properties here, we can see that I've got no tick box to confirm any changes that are made, so I must cancel out. So that's the first point that I want to make, is the ability to toggle this permission to prevent users modifying items in group-owned folders. The default, I believe, is on. If you turn that off, there is the risk that you can overwrite each other's data, so be aware of that. Now, so this is the first thing I wanted to talk about, and what I'm going to do here is say, well, we've talked about that, complete. The next one is to show group-owned permissions. So now, as a member of this group, you can see here that I can take ownership of the folder and I can make changes. So I could edit this attribute, for example. I could also create new items in the folder, or copy and paste things into the folder, or reserve and reference things into the folder, because I'm a member of the group and I have edit the switch off to prevent editing group-owned folders. So group-owned folder permissions allows me to do all of these things. Now, if you want to block people from editing the same folder or the content of the same folder, then if I assign this folder to a member of the management team, I will assign it to myself. Sorry, I've made the screen size a little bit bigger. Let me do this. So I'm assigning this to myself. Put a comment and the person will get an email notification. So now what we see is I am the owner of the folder as a member of the management team. Okay. Now that means I've got full edit capabilities as before over the content and the folder itself. If I was to assign this to somebody else within the team, let's say we assign it to Hercule Poirot the Inspector. At that point in time, I've lost the ability to edit the folder. You see it's grayed out because somebody within the team has taken ownership of the folder and therefore locking other members from editing it while they are working on it. Okay, it also will prevent me from having permission to modify items within it. So again, if I look at the properties of this file, I've got no edit capabilities. Okay, so group owned permissions, individual owned permissions. I'm going to set that to completed. Okay, so we've covered that one. I'm going to assign this back to myself as the owner, as a member of the management team. So I'm now the owner again, and again to demonstrate, I now have edit capability over this item because I've taken specific ownership. So the subject, so they're basic access controls. I didn't plan on showing how to configure basic access controls because I'll show that when I show the not as owner access controls. So the next topic is how do we set these not as owner access controls. I'm going to choose a group called the management team. Okay. Now, if I, just before we go into the admin tool, access controls are based on the type of item, in this case it's a web folder, the status of the folder, the ownership of the folder, and the business unit that it is a member of. So let's go into the access controls here. So under system access, access controls for web folders. Where are we? Web portal. Is this the one I use or not? I should check, shouldn't I? Hold on, folder types. Web folder is called web portal. Okay. So web portal. Now, another thing to comment here is not as owner access controls only applies to folders and action types. An action is a folder. Okay, so not as owner access controls does not apply to parts, assemblies, drawings, and documents. Okay, it is not possible to do that at the moment. So if we look at this folder type, I want to edit the access controls for the engineering manager's team. So the scenario is you've assigned this folder or this task, this change order or project to somebody else, but you want to be able to have modify capabilities over and above the ownership, as in not as owner. So if I say, well, look, this is a management team and I want these people to be able to make these changes. By the way, if you chose all of these, you can edit all of them and apply changes to all groups. All we want to do at this point in time is edit this access control list. So the basic access control is when this folder is active, it is visible. When the folder is closed, it's visible. And you can create a folder at an active status. So that's a very basic access control. The next tab here, if you are the owner of the folder, as I've just demonstrated, then when the folder is at a status of active, you are allowed to modify. Now my folder type, web folder, is controlled by a workflow, and therefore I don't need to have manual state change switched on. And when we talk about state change, you always need to be able to go from a status to a status. So if this folder wasn't being controlled by a workflow, we would allow manually changing the status to and from and those options, and therefore you can go backwards and forwards, etc. As the owner of the folder, if it is active, I'm allowed to delete the folder. A comment to add to that is it will not let you delete a folder if the folder has content. So it won't allow you to delete something and to orphan information. So I've allowed delete on an active folder. I can add a divider, modify a divider, delete a divider, add a child link, as in an item within the folder, a sub-item, modify it and remove the child. I have no access controls switched on if the status is closed, because when we close the folder, the job's finished and we don't want people changing history. Okay, but those access controls are determined by you, depending on how you want those permissions to be. Okay, so today's topic is about over and above that, we now have the option of not as owner access controls. So if you are not the owner of the folder, at the moment, I have none of these access controls switched on. Okay, so I'm just going to confirm that. We're going to go back to our demonstration folder. I am the owner. What I'm going to do to demonstrate this is I'm going to assign this to Production Workshop, assign it to Joe, and say OK. So it's now owned by a different group, and I'm not the owner. That's mine. I'm going to confuse you. Let me just set a different user. So let's say Andy Stubbins. Okay, so this is owned by somebody else as a member of a different group, and therefore I've got no permission. If I try and remove an item from the folder, I'm not allowed. I can't edit the folder attributes. I can't edit anything within it, etc. Okay, we're going to go back to the admin tool, back to the access controls for this folder type, to engineering managers, because not as owner, if the folder is active, I want to be allowed to modify the attributes of the folder. Okay, I can't change the child references, adding and removing child information. So if I confirm that and go back here and I refresh, my edit capability has come back and I can edit the attributes against the folder, etc. Okay, so I've just updated that, not as the owner. Bearing in mind, if you allow this to many people, somebody can edit it and whoever saves last wins. I'm hoping that makes sense to everybody. The last person to edit is the person that wins. Okay, so, you know, with all of these access controls come with a level of understanding, and you make the rules, and within those rules it can be good or bad. Okay, now I can't edit the content or remove content from the folder. Okay, if I drop back into my main database and I look for a purchased item and adhesive, I want this Loctite, and if I try and copy this Loctite into this folder, it won't allow me to paste it in. I don't have permission to add anything to the folder. We're going to go back to the access controls and we're going to modify them again. And this time, not only can I modify the folder, not as the owner, I want to be able to add a divider, modify a divider, add a child link, and modify a child link, and then confirm. I'm not going to allow myself to delete the folder, but it's obvious what delete does, and delete won't let you delete if there is content in the folder. So I've updated the access controls again, and now I can paste items into the folder, because not as owner I'm allowed to add a child. I can also edit a child, and I can also remove the child. So I've adding and removing things from the folder with my not as owner permissions. Okay, it does not allow me to edit the files that are reserved into the folder. It does not give me that permission. That is down to the owner of the folder. Okay, so modify means that you can edit the attributes of the folder. Adding and removing children you can, but if something is reserved to the folder, only the owner can modify the content. Okay, I can also add a new divider. So this is basically workshop topic actions. Okay, I tend to use green for my dividers. I've added a divider like this, and can I modify the children and put them in there? Okay, so not as owner permission, we've been through this. The ability to add, modify or remove items, subfolders or subdividers. Now that point, and the ability to modify the attributes of the folder, and the ability to delete the folder, change to and from status. Okay, now this child item and child folder makes me think of another control that you might want to be aware of. Okay, so before I go into that, the ability to set your access controls not as the owner of a folder, and those access controls are detailed in the administration tool. If I go into engineering managers, for this folder type, not as the owner, I've given these people these permissions. Okay, so confirm. The other thing that I was going to show you was the ability to add, modify and remove child items. Against the definition of a folder type, for each folder type, if I go to my web portal folder, down here in the left hand frame, select allowed content type. So you can control what type of child objects are allowed in folders. So parts, drawings, documents, etc. Now if I said, for example, you can't have milestones requirements inside as a sub-item of this folder, you can switch them on and off. So this is another hard-coded capability that you may come across. I'm hoping that makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to my tasks. The final one is not as owner does not allow you to transition through a workflow. The modify command only allows you to modify the attributes on the folder template.